Good morning, how we doing? Well, I am glad to be back for sure. Had a great vacation, went into Alaska, visited Nicole's family, and had some adventures, spent some time by the seaside. It was great. Went with my boys, found sea creatures and everything else, all sorts of good stuff. But I'm excited for some other reasons too. You know, first I'm excited because Adam's here. That's really exciting. But I'm excited that while I was on vacation, Pastor Lim was released. Right? For those of you who are new to Whitehorse Baptist, maybe don't know this kind of bit of a journey that we've been going through, even within this series of Ordinary People, Radical Joy, and the third message, and kind of just talking about persecution and what's happening, what happened in the early church, what happened in our current world. Chan here, a member of our church, he actually came from Toronto, and that is his pastor in Toronto. So he moved to Whitehorse. And so we were able to do an interview, and you can get that on the podcast, or you can get that online if you missed that sermon. And Chan and I did a bit of an interview to find the background of who Pastor Lim really is. And we got a bit of an inside on who he was, his passion for the gospel, passionate to see the gospel and passionate to see freedom reached in North Korea. And so he was put into prison, and he was first going to be put to death, but then they changed his sentence to life imprisonment, but then he was released. And this church, as well as many churches, were praying for that. And on Sunday, after that news report, on Sunday, Pastor Lim addressed his congregation. And the church has translated that Korean message into English, and you can read the full thing. But this morning I want to start off by reading a few excerpts from what he said to his congregation and what he said to really Christians all over Canada and people all over Canada that were praying for him. I am so grateful that God has allowed me to be here with everyone today. I am grateful for my church community. I'm indebted to all the churches in Canada, the United States, and in Korea. The many friends around the world who have prayed daily for 2 years and 7 months until the moment I was released and returned home. Through those prayers and the efforts of all involved, I finally came home yesterday, landing at 10 a.m. on Canadian soil. It still feels like a dream. Truly, this is all by the grace of God. I was sentenced to death by North Korea, but the sentence was commuted to life of hard labor. That too was God's grace and gave me tremendous peace. From that moment, there were days of overwhelming loneliness. From the first day of my detainment until the day I was released, I ate 2,757 meals in isolation by myself. It was difficult to see when and how the entire ordeal would end. But this isolation also gave me the opportunity to spend an extended time of solitude with God. During my time there, I read over 100 books on North Korea and began to grasp and gain a deeper understanding of the 70-year history that formed the nation. I also read the Bible in both English and Korean 5 times and memorized over 700 Bible verses. I worshiped alone for 130 Sundays. While I was laboring, I prayed without ceasing. There were many difficult moments, but it was during these times that God gave me the strength to endure and persevere. There were moments of discouragement, resentment, and grumbling, but that soon changed to courage, joy, and thanksgiving. I learned to fully accept all of this as a form of God's love and discipline to make me stronger. By God's perfect and sovereign timing, I was released, returned home, and here with you today. You can read the full, it's much longer. I only grabbed a few excerpts. I actually really probably couldn't get through some of what he endured while he was there. And Pastor Lim's testimony has everything to do with what we're going to study today. We've been going through a series, Ordinary People, Radical Joy, and today we're going to talk about the secret of contentment. And Pastor Lim is a real-life example who read these words only last Sunday, who is a true testimony of commitment and finding the secret of commitment within extreme circumstances. And so Paul's words, which we're about to study this morning, could not be lived in such a great testimony. we start with an amazing example. So with that in mind, let's get into the Word. Let's look at Philippians 4 and read what Paul says about contentment. If you don't have a Bible, you can, the passage will appear on the screen or under one of the seats in front of you. You may find a Bible there. If you don't own a Bible, or maybe you've lost yours, or maybe you want a second Bible to give away, talk to the greeters at the back, either right now on the way out, and they'll give you a Bible, and you can put your name in it. It's yours. Take it. Or give it away, whatever you want. Philippians 4, verses 10 through 13. Philippians 4, verses 10 through 13. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. In verses 11 and 12, Paul, he outlines some ways that he had to be content, some different circumstances. He says that he learned, it says he knows how to be brought low. He knows how to abound. He knows how to face plenty. He knows hunger. He knows abundance. And he knows what it means to be in need. And yet he found contentment. Well, maybe some of you are saying, okay, wait a second, Jeremy, stop. I've read a bit about Paul in the Bible, and from what I know, Paul just got kicked around the modern world like a can. He was shipwrecked, he was put in prison, he had all sorts of terrible stuff happening to him. Can you turn me a little bit down, Adam? Because I'm probably going to yell before the sermon's over. Just because Jeremy's back. Okay. Loud and proud, here we go. So, Paul has endured all this, and you might think, well, wait a second. From what I understand of Paul, he's only had bad times. As I read through the New Testament, I don't hear that Paul had many good times. But this is a bit of a context reminder for us from stuff we've learned a little earlier. Because before Paul was called and transformed by the gospel, he had a whole different life. He was a religious leader, remember? And he was actually in charge, in case you didn't know, he was in charge of persecuting, killing, imprisoning Christians. He had to hunt them down. You see, this guy named Jesus was messing up the religious system. He was moving away from this concept of law to a concept of grace and introducing grace. And the religious leaders, it was messing things up this way, the truth and the life called Jesus. And so Paul, he was under the religious authority to go down and hunt them down. And so with that religious authority, the thing that we can know is he had people under his command. He could tell them where to go. Also working for that religious institution, he would have had his needs met. He would have lived a life not only of status and authority, but one of security. This was Paul's previous life. He probably had a nice 3 square meals a day, probably snacks when he wanted them. Though he was under the law, he knew the law. He was the law. This was his previous life. And so if we now think of what Paul says, now all of a sudden we understand his previous life, which was status and security before Jesus. But then all of a sudden, Jesus transforms his life. The gospel penetrates his heart. And then he learns servanthood and suffering after Jesus. And this really goes against any great televangelists that say, come to know Jesus and all your troubles and cares will they'll just wash away. Wait a second, that didn't happen for Paul. His pre-Jesus life would have been a lot better, but the gospel transformed him. And so he truly knows what it means to be in both. Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown's commentary states this regarding this word content that Paul uses. He says, the Greek literally expresses independent of others and having sufficiency in oneself. But Christianity has raised the term above the haughty sufficiency of the heathen Stoic to the contentment of the Christian, whose sufficiency is not found in self, but in God. And this is what Paul's saying. We'll get to verse 13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. This is where he's at. This contentment that he found is not in his self. He never went out and came across this and just found it. He only achieved it through Jesus. And this is the only way, really, we can find true contentment. But there's another key word that happens twice in this passage. Paul says he has learned to be content, and actually says, I've learned the secret. Because it's not something that's found easily. And as I think about this learned behavior, what does it mean? Well, it makes me think of my childhood and where I'm at now. My parents, in case you didn't know, they're from Northern England, and they immigrated in the mid-'70s, and they had me in '79. Now, for those of you that remember the late '70s, early '80s, raising a family, from what I understand, getting available credit was not as easy as it is today. And my mom often tells me, Jeremy, I feel so sorry for your generation raising a family. So I was like, really? We got it made. No. She feels bad because there's so much debt available to us. There's so many things that allow us to not be content that she never had raising a young family. For example, mortgage rates, where I have like 2-3% now is the new offers. It's crazy. They had 18-19% mortgages. When you wanted to get a car loan, and some of you can validate this, if you had to go to the bank, you wanted to dress nice, supposedly. Like you wanted to make a good impression. You're going to go to the banking officer. We're going to try to get a loan. You're going to be very polite, and you're going to explain everything. And this bank held the keys kind of to whether or not you were going to get a loan for a new car or maybe a business. And you really had to pitch yourself. And your credit limit was super important. Your credit rating was super important. Now it doesn't matter. So there was a forced contentment that my parents had to live with. If their car broke down and they didn't save a bit of money for that breakdown, or maybe my dad was an electrician, he could maybe trade some work down the block for a mechanic. There were other creative ways that they had to fix the car if the money hadn't been saved. There wasn't just as many available credit cards as it is in my generation. And no, we're not picking on millennials today. All the millennials are like, oh, hallelujah. Because I believe a lot of millennial problems have a lot to do with boomers and Gen Xers, but that's a different message. And so as they talked about how they raised a young family versus now, I think about me. My class, when I was in grade 11, grade 12, we were the first class, at least in Ontario, that Visa and MasterCard would show up at school events and offer this thing called a student credit card. And this was like all new. And so for a teenager, it's like, Visa wants to give me free money. I'm in. Everything I ever wanted. These guys give it. And at first it was like a $500 limit, but then you'd get a notice. We've upped your limit. You're that important. All of a sudden, the banker that my parents knew where they had to impress, all of a sudden the banker's trying to impress me. Right? And the world of families got flipped on its head. And all of a sudden, choices for contentment were abundant. Just one more credit card, one more line of credit. And for those of you that maybe are thinking, oh, okay, well, he's kind of beating down credit card, maybe you're thinking, oh, he's reading my mail, what's going on? I want you to know, for those of you who've been around Whitehorse Baptist a while, I am not perfect in any way. And some of you know Nicole and I's story. We were living in Calgary, and I had tons of things that could make me content. I was working in sales and marketing in an airport hotel in Calgary. My wife was working at the Hotel Arts downtown doing accounting. We were making bank. We were loving it. We also sold a condo. We got a huge price. We made $50,000 on a condo in 8 months. Boom. But the best part about making lots of money is that you can spend more than you make. And so as long as the amount you make grows higher, then your spending can double it. It's amazing. And so we just lived high on the hog until the Lord says, I want you to go into ministry. Okay. And I carried my debt load into my first youth pastor position. It was all great until the church had trouble, and there was those couple weeks where, in order to keep the heat and the lights on, the elders came and said, we can't afford to pay the staff. Whoa. So I have a job, but I'm doing it for free because I'm doing it for the Lord. Can't quit. This is a whole new world. And let me tell you, nothing will give you a lesson on contentment as when you now have to put eggs and milk on a credit card, because there is nothing. And when the bank sends the statements and you can't cover the basic amount of interest, all of a sudden the world of contentment and what you want and what you need, it hits you like a train wreck. And by the grace of God, only by the grace of God and his discipline on my life, I was able, it was mostly my fault, but Nicole helped me in that journey very much. And we were able to get out of debt. But as I think about it now, as I think back to Paul's words and this thing of contentment, and as I think of my world and where I'm at now, 20 years as an adult, I've got a family, I have peers the same as me, and it's a very different world we live in. We have to absolutely choose contentment. There is almost nothing today in Canadian society for someone like me. There is really nothing that's going to force me to contentment. Everything I want, pretty much I can have. And it takes a long, long road of the Lord's discipline in order to overcome that. At that time, when I think about back then, our marriage was absolutely crumbling. There were some other things, but we fought a lot about money. And it was because the debt load was just huge. When you're looking at tens of thousands of dollars, and even if you were to take your whole annual salary and put it towards your debt, it still wouldn't be enough. It's overwhelming. And it pounds on the marriage. It pounds on the family. And it's not a coincidence that if you look at psychologists, if you look at counselors, and if you ask them, say, okay, when people come in, what's going on? What are they talking about? 3 things rise to the top: sex, money, and communication. And I have friends who are psychologists, and when someone comes in, they can pretty much roll the dice that 1 out of 3 tries it's going to be money. Or a lot of times it's a layer of a couple things, and one of them is money. And when they start unpacking the money, it's not, or hardly ever, is it we just have too full of a bank account, and we're just arguing on what to spend all our money on. And so we're in counseling right now because I've got $100,000 cash, and he wants a boat, and I want a cabin. And we might get a divorce over this. That's not a story that happens often. Usually, it's he's bought a boat, and I bought a cabin, and we owe $100,000 still, and we don't know where we're going to find it. That's the contentment problem. And as the counselor unpacks it all, and as it goes down, they talk about value differences and how to communicate your feelings and your thoughts. But when it comes down to it, it's 2 people, or perhaps one person in marriage, that is not content. And eventually the counselor has to ask, why are you not content with what you have? You have a good job, you have a good life, you live in a good country, there's no one beating down your door, there's no why are you not content? What is it that causes you to not be content? And it's sin. This world wants to tell you that there is always one more thing that'll make you more content. And I know it because I felt it. I'm not telling you that I'm a perfect guy. I'm telling you, I have felt it. It has beat me down. I have felt it. And there it is again. Satan's like, don't tell these people about this. All right. So, in your marriage, in your relationship, maybe in your personal life, I understand that some of what I'm talking about causes a lot of anxiety. I get it. I don't want you to feel like I'm layering judgment on you. That's not what I'm doing. I'm explaining to you that Paul is a man that knew what it was like to live in need, and he's learned that contentment, and we can too. And Christians should be the ones who champion contentment. People outside should look in the church and say, look, you don't have everything you want. How are you content? And there is an amazing opportunity there to share the gospel, because it's the gospel that causes us to be content. There's a great book at the back. Cornelia and the library team keep bringing us awesome literature. And there's a man, Dr. Gregory Jansen, and in this book, you may want it, 7 Answers for Anxiety. I understand that money is a huge anxiety thing, a huge stress thing. And there's a part in that book where he talks about the contentment commitment, and he writes this: anxious people could learn a thing or two about contentment from the Apostle Paul. In his letter to the Philippians, he made an astonishing statement. He said he had learned to be content, whatever the circumstance. Philippians 4:11. Paul said that in any situation he could find contentment, working hard, in prison, flogged, in danger of life, beating, pelted with stones, shipwrecked. If he could learn through all of that to find contentment, shouldn't we be able to learn to find contentment? I like that Paul said he learned. I feel better because that means Paul wasn't one of those people who are naturally content. And often we make Paul in the same level as Jesus, and it's really a false thing. Paul was a man, a person just like you or I. And through the miraculous leading of the Holy Spirit and Jesus Christ, he was able to do amazing things, but he was a man who struggled. And he learned contentment, which means if he learned that, that means he didn't have contentment once upon a time. And if you're sitting here and you're saying, okay, man, I don't know if I'm a content person, that's okay. Paul had that problem too. Other people have had that problem. I have had that problem of never being content with where I'm at. It's a normal thing. You know, yesterday we had a garage sale. And I had to lay down a few last things. My Harley-Davidson helmet and my Harley-Davidson rain gear and boots and some other things. And this has actually been a journey for me. A year ago, I had to get rid of my Harley-Davidson. It was a real hard discipline from the Lord regarding contentment. There were things going on in my family. I was at this stage of life where I couldn't afford a midlife crisis. Not in this role, nor having 3 boys. Right around the time when Mark was born, it was like a light came and said, you got to get rid of the Harley. And it was hard to lay that down. And it took a year for me to let go of the gear, because in my mind, I'm like, no, I'll get another. Oh, and things are going to work itself out. And, I'll manage. Some guy's just going to drive up to my house and say, hey, I don't want this anymore. Do you want it? Like, it could happen. The Lord does miracles, right? But I had to get to a point where I had to say, am I content with my family? Is it all about me and my thing, or is it about my family? I'm not saying it was difficult. It was one of the most difficult decisions I have ever made. Like, I'm going to be honest, I cried a bit when I sold the Harley. And so even yesterday, there was a serious depression letting that stuff go. There was something that was in me that was painful. And for those of you that own motorcycles, you know what I'm saying. If you don't, try to think of some other thing that you love a lot. For some guys, it's a boat or a gun or I don't know, whatever. But for me, this was huge. But I had to choose to finally let go of some of that stuff. And it's a first world problem. Let's be clear. On the podcast, I am talking about a first world problem right now. Please, this is not a big deal. But in our Western culture, these are the types of things. And I don't know what it's like to speak from a woman's perspective, but for a guy's perspective, we get bombarded with toys. We get bombarded, and they market to us like crazy, especially up here in the north. And it is hard to be content. Super hard. But the last thing Paul says, he says, I can do all things through him, Jesus Christ, who strengthens me. And when I was in Alberta, I really loved rodeos. I loved rodeos a lot. And bull riding, bronc riding, guys wrecking themselves on animals, so good. So good. Nicole's like this. I'm like, and so that's one thing I really miss about Alberta is rodeos. And what's fascinating to me about rodeos is there's one verse that appears all the time. It'll be scribed on their chaps. It'll be on their hats, on their boots. You'll see this reference 4:13. It'll be everywhere. Here's a couple examples on slides of it just appears everywhere. And there's a bit of a really false context. They pull this verse out, and there's this assumption. They're like, see that? Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Give me that bull. There's this idea, I'm a cowboy, I'm going to get on the back of a 2,000-pound animal with sharp horns, and he will not stomp me because I got Philippians 4:13 on my chaps. And I find it so ironic within rodeo culture because rodeo culture, and if you know anything about rodeo culture and cowboys, they are some of the most indebted athletes in the world. In order for them to travel and get all their gear and the animals and all the other things they have, rodeo cowboys, if you look, they have massive, massive debt problems. And a lot of times when they retire out of rodeo, a lot of them are broken. They lose their farms. They lose everything. It fascinates me that that's one of the number one verses that's quoted in rodeo cowboy culture, and yet if they just read a few verses beforehand, they would get a vastly different contextual realization. And cowboys aren't the only ones, because I hear this all the time with people. They lay out this verse, pull it fully out, and they're like, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I'll just put it on a credit card. Right? I will get to Europe any way possible. There's so many things that people use this out of context where if they just read it a little bit, this verse comes out of the understanding that one of the most difficult things to do is to go without. So in all things through Christ who strengthens you, you really want a challenge? Step away from the bull, go hungry for 40 days. Let's see how you do with that challenge. Go without. Don't take on what the world is telling you that you need. That is a challenge. And, to end this message, I can't think of a better way to sum up this than Pastor Lim's testimony. There's one word that he spoke last Sunday that this encapsulates this entire passage. And this is real life. This is, firsthand with Chan here. We have one connection off from this guy. He's a real guy. 2017. He said these words last Sunday, a week ago today. And I cannot think of a better example to pinpoint what Paul is getting at than what he says here. He says this sentence, I learned to fully accept all of this as a form of God's love and discipline to make me stronger. I've never endured anything that he's gone through, and Lord willing, I will never have to. But if you're in a huge amount of debt and you lose your job, man, praise the Lord. Get on your knees, thank him. Thank you for opening up the floodgates of discipline on me so I have to face my problems. If I'm maybe in relationships and I keep dancing around with people who don't know Jesus, and my relationships just continue to break and bumble, praise be to God. I need to be content with Jesus, and I need to wait to find someone that loves him more than I love him. And this goes through so many different areas of life where we're just not content. And if we really want to be brave, if we really want to do all things through Christ, we should get on our knees and we should ask him to pour out his loving discipline on us and to put bookends into our life so that we can't go any further, so that we're faced with our own problems. Because on the back end, it's glorious. It's amazing. I know I can speak financially. I can give you that testimony. I can't tell you enough. I just got back from vacation. I cannot tell you how fulfilling it is to go on a vacation, to put nothing on credit, and to come home with some money left. I cannot tell you, I cannot express to you. And when I talk to my peers, very few of them even know what that means. And to someone who has waited, who's wanted to be married, and they wait and wait and wait, and then someone comes who knows Jesus and who loves Jesus more than them, they cannot express how content they are. The difficulties that lead to contentment, the discipline that we put ourselves under is amazing. It's miraculous. I can't express it enough. As we go to worship, I'm going to ask the worship team to come forward. The ushers can come forward too. We're going to go into a time of worship. Maybe a lot of this is huge, and I understand that a lot of what I've said is difficult to hear. I do not mean to layer on judgment to you. If you're new here and just landed, you're like, oh my goodness, this pastor's crazy. I'm just preaching through the passage. This is where we landed. You just happen to show up this Sunday. We want people to experience the freedom that the gospel offers in this church. The freedom that the gospel offers in all areas of life, financially and otherwise. And so if you're struggling and you've been burdened by something that's been said today and you need prayer for that, the elders and I will be up front. Please come forward. We will pray with you. And if you need help in some way, we can set you up with a plan to get back on top. We don't mind doing that. We want you to experience the freedom. We want you to be able to do all things through Jesus Christ. And we're going to sing as well. You can sit and pray if you'd like. That's fine. There's no demand. And then another thing we do through worship is we give. Sometimes the first step of discipline is to give of our tithes and offering. I knew a guy in Alaska who lost his job at the plant, and he made a commitment to the Lord that even while he was out of work, he would continue to tithe the amount that he was when he was without work. And he was out without work for I think 6 or 8 months out there in Alaska, and he was a real testimony to a lot of the men in our group. And giving is not an obligation. It's not a guilt thing. If you're feeling any guilt, don't put anything in the plate. Don't give. You can give online if you want, though. It's a form of worship. It's something we do. We discipline ourselves to show the Lord. We believe that he has given us every good and perfect gift. We believe that the things we have are from him, and so we take a portion of that and we give it back to say, hey, thanks for giving it to me. Here's a bit back. And I assure you that if you give to this church, we will use it to reach and teach people for Jesus. It is not wasted here. But if you want to give to another mission organization or anything, I'm good with that too, whatever the Lord's leading you to.